Hashtag Mountain Man's Redemption, Colorado Territory, 1875. The jagged peaks of the San Juan Mountains stood like silent sentinels over the valley where Jackson Mercer had built his solitary cabin. At 26, Jackson was younger than most who chose the lonely existence of a mountain man, but his eyes carried the weathered look of someone who had seen too much of the world's harshness too soon. The early autumn wind whispered through the pines as Jackson skinned the rabbit he'd caught in one of his traps. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, his broad shoulders and lean frame evidence of a life lived through physical labor. Despite his youth, he'd already decided that some paths weren't meant for him. Marriage, family, connection, these were luxuries for men who hadn't watched an Apache raid take their parents at 14, hadn't spent their formative years moving from settlement to settlement, taking work where they could find it. The mountains don't lie to you, he murmured to himself, a habit formed from years of solitude. They don't promise what they can't deliver. His cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, smoke curling from the stone chimney. Inside was sparse but functional. A bed, a table he'd crafted himself, shelves lined with the few books he'd collected. Everything a man needed and nothing he didn't. No complications. No disappointments. Jackson had come to these mountains 3 years earlier, after a stint as a cavalry scout had left him with a bullet scar on his left shoulder and a deeper wound in his spirit. He trapped, hunted, occasionally panned for gold, and twice a year made the journey to Silverton to trade furs and supplies. It was enough. It had to be. As he finished with the rabbit and wiped his knife clean, he caught sight of a piece of paper tacked to the doorframe of his cabin. The notice from the territorial governor's office had arrived with his last supply delivery. New settlers were coming, a planned community in the valley below. Progress, they called it. Jackson called it the end of peace. Just what I need, he said, gazing down at the pristine valley that would soon be parceled and claimed. More people bringing more trouble. The truth he wouldn't admit aloud was that sometimes, in the deepest part of winter when nights stretched long and cold, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. If somewhere, in some alternate life, there might have been room for something warmer than solitude. But those thoughts were dangerous. A man survived out here by accepting reality, not chasing mirages. And the reality was that Jackson Mercer was meant for the mountains, not for hearth and home. The frontier was no place for love, only survival. And he'd long ago decided that survival meant standing alone. 2 weeks later, Jackson watched from the tree line as the first wagons rolled into the valley. He hadn't planned to be there, but curiosity had drawn him down from his hunting grounds. 5 wagons in total, carrying what looked to be 3 families. Children scrambled out once the wagons stopped, their excited voices carrying across the meadow. Too close, Jackson muttered, turning to head back up the mountain. But something made him pause, a flash of blue fabric against the brown and green landscape. A young woman had stepped away from the group, walking toward the river that curved through the valley. The blue of her dress stood out like a cornflower against the dry grass. Her honey-blonde hair was partially pinned up, with loose curls escaping to dance around her shoulders in the breeze. Even from this distance, there was something in the way she moved, purposeful but gentle, that caught his attention. Jackson watched as she knelt by the riverbank, dipping her hand into the clear mountain water. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. Too young, too delicate for the harsh realities of territorial life. These settlers never understood what they were getting into. Half would be gone by winter's end. As if sensing his gaze, the young woman suddenly looked up, scanning the tree line where he stood. Jackson stepped back into the shadows of the forest, but not before their eyes met across the distance. Something electric and unexpected passed between them in that brief moment. Recognition, perhaps, though they'd never met. Unsettled, Jackson turned and disappeared into the woods, determined to put more distance between himself and the settlement. He had supplies to gather before the first snow. He didn't have time for distractions, especially ones with honey-blonde hair and eyes that seemed to see right through him. Penelope Larson had felt someone watching her from the moment she'd approached the river. The sensation had prickled at the back of her neck, drawing her gaze upward to the tree line. There, partially concealed in shadow, stood a man, tall, broad-shouldered, watching her with intensity even from a distance. Their eyes had locked for just a moment before he'd vanished, like a spirit of the wilderness. "Penny, come help with the tents," her father's voice called, breaking her reverie. Coming, father. She rose from the riverbank, brushing dust from her blue calico dress. But her eyes lingered on the spot where the stranger had stood. At 22, Penelope had left behind a comfortable life in St. Louis to accompany her father to the Colorado Territory. Thomas Larson had grand visions of building a new life after the death of Penny's mother 2 years prior. He'd invested in a sawmill operation, planning to supply lumber to the mining operations that dotted the mountains. "What are you looking at?" asked Martha Wilson, wife of her father's business partner and the closest thing to a friend Penny had in the settlement group. "I thought I saw someone watching from the trees," Penny replied, still gazing at the forest's edge. Martha clutched Penny's arm. "Indians." Penny shook her head. "No, just a man. Probably a trapper or prospector." "Well, let's hope he stays in the trees where he belongs," Martha said with a small shiver. "I've heard stories about these mountain men, wild as the bears they hunt." But as Penny helped establish their camp, she found her thoughts returning to the stranger. There had been something in his eyes, not wildness, but a deep solitude that had called to something within her. Since her mother's passing, Penny had felt a similar isolation, even surrounded by society in St. Louis. It was part of why she'd so readily agreed to this frontier adventure. That night, as the settlers gathered around campfires, Penny's father stood to address the group. "Tomorrow we begin building our town," Thomas announced, his voice carrying the authority of a natural leader. "We'll start with the sawmill, then our homes. By spring, we'll have established a proper community here." There was a murmur of agreement, but Penny noticed how several of the women exchanged uncertain glances. They had left civilization behind for their husbands' dreams. Some looked afraid, others resigned. Penny felt neither. Instead, a curious anticipation had taken root within her. The frontier represented possibility in a way St. Louis never had. Here, perhaps, she could become more than Thomas Larson's dutiful daughter. Later, as she lay in the wagon looking up at stars brighter than any she'd seen before, Penny made a silent promise to herself. Here, in this wild place, she would finally discover who she truly was, not who society expected her to be. Jackson avoided the valley for nearly a month, pushing deeper into the mountains for his hunting and trapping. But as autumn's golden touch began to fade toward winter's gray, necessity drove him towards Silverton for supplies. His usual route would take him within view of the new settlement. He told himself it was simple curiosity that slowed his pace as he approached the ridge overlooking the valley. In the weeks since the wagons had arrived, the settlers had been busy. A large structure, the beginning of a sawmill, he guessed, stood half-completed near the river. Several smaller cabins dotted the clearing, and a rudimentary road had been carved from the valley floor to the nearest established trail. Movement caught his eye, a figure walking alone along the riverbank. Even without the blue dress, he recognized her. The blonde woman from the first day, now wearing a simpler brown skirt and white blouse, her hair braided and pinned up. She carried a basket, occasionally stooping to collect something from the ground. Before he fully realized his intention, Jackson found himself descending the ridge, staying within the tree line, but moving closer to where she gathered what appeared to be late-season berries and plants. She was humming softly to herself, seemingly unaware of his presence until she straightened and spoke without turning. "Are you going to keep hiding in the trees, or might you come introduce yourself properly?" Her voice carried clearly in the crisp air, startling Jackson into stillness. She turned then, facing directly toward his position with a confidence that suggested she'd known he was there all along. "I don't bite," she added with the hint of a smile, "though I cannot speak for the berries. Some might be bitter this late in the season." Caught, Jackson stepped reluctantly from the shelter of the pines. Up close, she was even more striking. Clear blue eyes set in a heart-shaped face, skin touched golden by the sun, a light dusting of freckles across her nose. "I wasn't hiding," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Just passing through to Silverton." "Through the trees, rather than on the trail?" Her eyebrow arched skeptically, but her smile remained. "I'm Penelope Larson. My friends call me Penny." Jackson Mercer. He didn't step closer, maintaining a careful distance. "I live up the mountain." "Ah, you're the mountain man everyone's been talking about." Her eyes sparkled with interest. "Father says you might know where to find the best timber stands. He's building the sawmill." "Your father's wasting his time," Jackson said bluntly. First, heavy snow will block any wagon from getting lumber out of this valley until spring thaw. By then, half your settlement will have given up. Rather than appearing offended, Penny tilted her head thoughtfully. Perhaps, but those who stay will have built something lasting. She gestured to her basket. I'm gathering medicinal herbs before the first frost. Would you happen to know where I might find yarrow? My book says it grows in these mountains. The abrupt change of subject caught Jackson off guard. South-facing slopes, about half a mile that way, he pointed. White flowers, feathery leaves. Thank you. She smiled. Would you mind showing me? I'd hate to pick the wrong plant and poison someone accidentally. I don't. Jackson began a refusal, then stopped. Something about her direct gaze made evasion feel childish. I don't have much time. I need to reach town before dark. It won't take long, she countered. And perhaps you might tell me what other useful plants grow here. We'll need to be prepared for winter illnesses. That practical concern, so different from the helplessness he expected from new settlers, was what finally persuaded him. With a curt nod, Jackson adjusted his pack. This way, but I can't linger. As they walked, Penny matched his stride with surprising ease. She asked intelligent questions about local plants, weather patterns, and game animals. Her knowledge was clearly book-learned rather than practical, but her eagerness to understand the environment impressed him despite himself. When they reached the yarrow patch, she knelt and carefully harvested some stems, explaining as she worked, My mother was skilled with herbal remedies. I've been studying her journals since we decided to come west. Your mother's here? Jackson asked, scanning the valley. A shadow crossed Penny's face. No. She passed 2 years ago. Influenza. I'm sorry, Jackson said awkwardly, recognizing the familiar weight of loss in her voice. Thank you. She straightened, tucking the yarrow into her basket. It's partly why we came west. Father needed a fresh start, and She paused, looking toward the mountains. I needed space to become something other than the daughter everyone pitied. The unexpected candor silenced Jackson. He'd assumed these settlers were like all the others he'd encountered, naive dreamers or desperate fools. But there was a clear-eyed determination in Penelope Larson that suggested something different. Winter comes early here, he said finally, looking at the darkening sky. First snow will be within 2 weeks. You should warn your people. Will you come to the settlement and tell them yourself? Penny asked. They'd listen to someone who knows these mountains. They wouldn't welcome a stranger. You're only a stranger until you introduce yourself, she countered. Then, more softly, not everyone fears what they don't understand, Mr. Mercer. Something in her words, or perhaps the way she said them, struck uncomfortably close to truth. Jackson adjusted his pack again, a nervous gesture he immediately regretted. I need to reach Silverton before nightfall, he said, retreating to practicality. The yarrow's good for fever and wounds. Steep it in hot water, not boiling. Penny nodded, accepting his withdrawal. Thank you for your help. Perhaps when you return from town, you might stop by our settlement. We could trade information for a hot meal. Perhaps, Jackson said noncommittally, already stepping away. Good day, Miss Larson. Until next time, Mr. Mercer, she replied, her confident tone suggesting she considered it a certainty rather than a possibility. As Jackson continued toward Silverton, he found himself unsettled in a way he hadn't been in years. The woman's directness, her lack of fear or deference, had caught him off balance. Most troubling was how easily she'd made him speak, more words than he'd uttered to another person in months. Won't be a next time, he muttered to himself, picking up his pace. The sooner he completed his business in town and returned to his cabin, the sooner he could forget about Penelope Larson and her disconcerting blue eyes. But even as he thought it, Jackson suspected he was lying to himself. The first snow came earlier than even Jackson had predicted. He'd returned from Silverton just in time, the fat flakes beginning to fall as he reached his cabin. Within days, nearly 2 feet of snow blanketed the mountain, and Jackson settled into his winter routine, checking trap lines, hunting when possible, reading by lamplight during the long evenings. He told himself he wasn't thinking about the settlement below, about how the newcomers were faring in their first mountain winter. It wasn't his concern. They'd made their choice. Yet when the storm finally broke, leaving a crystalline blue sky above the white landscape, Jackson found himself strapping on snowshoes and heading down toward the valley, telling himself he was simply scouting new trap lines. The settlement came into view, smoke rising from several chimneys. The sawmill stood silent, partially covered in snowdrifts. As he watched from the ridge, he saw activity around the cabins, men clearing paths, women hanging laundry to freeze dry in the cold air. And there, moving between cabins with a covered basket, was a familiar figure in a red wool cloak. Jackson hesitated, then cursed his own foolishness as he began making his way down. He was nearly to the edge of the clearing when a shout went up from the settlement. "Rider coming! Fast!" Jackson stopped, watching as a lone horseman galloped into the settlement from the south trail, his horse laboring through the snow. The man dismounted clumsily, nearly falling, and Jackson could see even from a distance that he was injured. People gathered around the rider. Through the clear air, Jackson caught fragments of urgent conversation. "Attack! Miners! 3 men dead! Coming this way." Making a quick decision, Jackson emerged from the tree line and approached. Several men noticed him immediately, reaching for weapons. "Hold!" It was Penelope's voice. She pushed through the crowd, her face registering surprise and then relief at the sight of him. "Mr. Mercer, we were just speaking of finding you." "What's happened?" Jackson asked, his eyes moving from Penny to the injured rider, who was being helped toward one of the cabins. An older man with a silver-streaked beard stepped forward. "Thomas Larson." He introduced himself curtly. "My daughter mentioned you. We have trouble. Renegade miners attacked the Morrison homestead south of here. 3 dead. They're headed this way, looking for supplies and valuables before winter fully sets in." "How many?" Jackson asked. 7 or 8, according to Burke here." Larson nodded toward the injured rider. "Well armed. We have 12 men, but most haven't seen real fighting." Jackson assessed the situation quickly. The settlement was exposed, the buildings too scattered for effective defense. But with the deep snow, the attackers would be limited in their approach routes. "You need to consolidate," he said. "Get everyone into the 2 largest buildings. Bring in all your supplies, ammunition, water. Block the windows, but leave shooting ports." Larson nodded, clearly relieved to have someone with experience. "Burke says they're about 3 hours behind him." "Less now," Jackson corrected. "They'll move faster knowing he's warned you." He glanced at Penny, who was listening intently, her expression determined rather than frightened. "You should get inside. Help prepare the women and children." "I'll help organize our medical supplies," she replied. "We'll need them ready." She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for coming down from your mountain, Mr. Mercer." As she hurried away, Larson watched Jackson with a measuring look. "She said you'd come if we needed help." I didn't believe her. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. "I was checking trap lines." Heard the commotion. He looked around at the men already moving to follow his instructions. "You have rifles? Ammunition?" "Enough," Larson said. "Will you help us position our defenses?" For a brief moment, Jackson considered leaving. This wasn't his fight. These weren't his people. But then he caught sight of Penny again, directing 2 women carrying blankets toward the main cabin, and he knew he couldn't walk away. "Show me what you're working with," he said. The next 2 hours passed in frantic preparation. Jackson helped position the men, creating overlapping fields of fire that would catch the attackers in a crossfire if they approached as expected. The women and children were secured in the central cabin, while the men took defensive positions in and around the larger building that served as a community hall. As the sun began to lower, casting long blue shadows across the snow, Jackson found himself beside Penny in the main cabin, where she was organizing bandages and medicinal preparations. "You should move to the back room with the others," he told her. "I'll be needed here when the wounded come in." She replied without looking up. "I've seen bullet wounds before, Mr. Mercer. I won't faint." "It's not about fainting," Jackson said, lowering his voice. "These men aren't just miners looking for gold. The way they hit the Morrison place," Burke described it. "They're killers. If they break through, then we'll all be in danger regardless of which room I'm in." She finished, finally meeting his eyes. "I won't hide while others fight." A call from outside interrupted them. The lookout had spotted movement to the south. Jackson moved to leave, but Penny caught his arm. "Be careful," she said simply. The touch, the first human contact he'd had in longer than he could remember, sent an unexpected warmth through him. He nodded once and hurried outside. The attackers came just as the light was fading, a ragged line of mounted men emerging from the trees to the south. They'd clearly expected to surprise the settlement. Finding it prepared and defended gave them pause. They'll circle first, looking for weakness, Jackson told Larson as they watched from the community hall. When they attack, it'll be from multiple directions. We're ready, Larson said with more confidence than Jackson felt was warranted. The next hour unfolded in a series of probing attacks and exchanges of gunfire. The attackers were experienced, but hampered by the snow and the unexpected resistance. 2 of their men were hit in the initial exchange, one fatally. Jackson moved between positions, directing the settlers' fire, conserving ammunition where possible. The miners gradually grew more desperate and reckless, culminating in a full charge toward the community hall. In the chaotic firefight that followed, Jackson found himself exposed as he moved between buildings. A bullet grazed his arm, and another splintered wood inches from his head. He returned fire, dropping one attacker, then dived for cover as more shots kicked up snow around him. From his new position, Jackson could see one of the miners circling toward the back of the main cabin, where the defenses were thinnest. Without hesitation, he sprinted through the snow, intercepting the man just as he reached the cabin's rear window. They collided violently, Jackson's momentum carrying them both into a snowdrift. The miner was powerfully built, with a tangled beard and wild eyes. He swung a knife, slicing through Jackson's coat and drawing blood across his ribs before Jackson could grab his wrist. They struggled in the snow, each fighting for control of the knife. Jackson felt his strength beginning to wane, the cold and blood loss taking their toll, when suddenly the miner jerked and went limp. Behind him stood Penny, holding a bloodied fireplace poker, her face pale but resolute. "Inside," she said urgently, reaching to help Jackson up. "You're bleeding." Before he could respond, more gunfire erupted from the front of the settlement. The remaining attackers had mounted a desperate final charge. Jackson staggered to his feet, retrieving his rifle. "Stay inside," he ordered Penny, then moved toward the sound of fighting. The final confrontation was brief but deadly. 3 of the miners fell in the assault, and the remaining 2 fled into the gathering darkness. The settlement had held, but at a cost. 2 settlers dead, several more wounded, including Larson himself, who had taken a bullet in the shoulder. As the adrenaline of battle faded, Jackson became acutely aware of his own injuries. The knife wound along his ribs burned fiercely, and the bullet graze on his arm throbbed with each heartbeat. He made it as far as the steps of the main cabin before his vision began to darken at the edges. The last thing he remembered was Penny's voice calling his name and the sensation of falling into softness instead of snow. Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of gentle hands cleaning and binding his wounds, of voices speaking in hushed tones around him, of a cool cloth on his forehead when fever set in. Time lost meaning, measured only in moments of clarity amid fever dreams. In one such moment, he opened his eyes to find Penny sitting beside his bed, reading by lamplight. She looked up immediately, as if sensing his awareness. "Welcome back," she said softly. "How long?" His voice came out as a croak. 3 days, she replied, setting aside her book to help him drink from a cup of water. The knife wound became infected, but the fever broke last night. "You'll recover." As his mind cleared, memories of the fight returned. "Your father?" "Recovering well," she said. "As are the others. Thanks in large part to you." Jackson tried to sit up, but fell back with a groan as pain lanced through his side. "I need to get back to my cabin." "Not for at least a week," Penny stated firmly. "Doctor's orders, or mine, rather, since we don't have a proper doctor yet." "I can't stay here," Jackson insisted, though even to his own ears, the protest sounded weak. Penny regarded him with a mixture of exasperation and something softer, more difficult to name. "Why does it frighten you so much? Being among people who care whether you live or die?" The directness of her question struck him silent. In his weakened state, the careful walls he'd built around his thoughts seemed thinner, more permeable. "The mountains don't ask anything of me," he finally said. "People always want something." "Yes," Penny agreed unexpectedly. "People want connection, Mr. Mercer. They want to matter to someone else." "Is that so terrible?" Before he could formulate a response, she stood. "You should rest. We can continue this philosophical debate when you're stronger." As she moved to leave, Jackson surprised himself by reaching for her hand. "Thank you," he said simply. For saving my life. Her fingers tightened briefly around his. We saved each other, I think. Then she slipped away, leaving Jackson alone with thoughts more unsettled than his wounds. The next week passed in a strange limbo for Jackson, confined to bed initially, then limited to short walks as his strength returned. He found himself unwillingly integrated into the settlement's daily rhythms. Children brought him small treasures, interesting rocks, a carved wooden horse. Women delivered meals with shy thanks for his role in the settlement's defense. Men sought his advice on hunting, trapping, preparing for the deepening winter. Most disconcerting was how easily Penny moved in and out of his awareness, checking his wounds, bringing books from her father's collection, sitting with him in comfortable silence as she worked on mending or writing in her journal. Despite himself, Jackson began looking forward to these quiet moments. On the 7th day, feeling strong enough to return to his cabin, Jackson stepped outside to find Thomas Larson waiting for him. The older man's arm was still in a sling, but color had returned to his face. "Walk with me," Larson said, less a request than a gentle command. They moved slowly through the settlement, where signs of normalcy had returned despite the recent violence. Children played in the snow, men worked on reinforcing cabins against the winter, women hung wash on lines strung between buildings. "We owe you our lives," Larson said without preamble. "Every person here knows it. Anyone would have done the same," Jackson replied uncomfortably. Larson laughed, a short, knowing sound. "We both know that's not true. Most men would have stayed safely up on their mountain." He paused, looking directly at Jackson. "My daughter seems to think you're different from most men." Jackson felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with lingering fever. "Miss Larson is kind to everyone." "She is," Larson agreed. "But she doesn't champion everyone the way she's championed you. She was quite insistent that we needed your knowledge, your skills." His expression grew more serious. "Even before the attack, she spoke of you often." Unsure how to respond, Jackson remained silent, his eyes tracking a pair of children pulling a makeshift sled through the snow. "I understand you're planning to return to your cabin today," Larson continued. "Before you go, the settlement council would like to make you an offer." "I'm not looking for payment." Larson held up his good hand. "Not payment. An opportunity. We need someone who knows these mountains, who can teach us how to survive here. Someone to help with hunting, to guide our lumber operations when spring comes, to warn us of dangers." Jackson frowned. "You're offering me a job?" "I'm offering you a place," Larson corrected. "A cabin here in the settlement, if you want it. Or help expanding your current place, if you prefer to maintain some distance. Regular trade, connection to our supply lines when they're established." He paused. "And yes, fair compensation for your knowledge." The offer caught Jackson entirely off guard. He'd expected gratitude, perhaps, but not integration into the community he'd so carefully avoided. "I need time to think," he said finally. Larson nodded. "Of course. The offer stands, regardless of your decision." He glanced toward the path that led up toward Jackson's cabin. "Though I suspect there's someone who would be disappointed if you chose to remain completely isolated." Before Jackson could respond, Larson clapped him gently on his uninjured shoulder and walked away, leaving him with thoughts even more tumultuous than before. By midday, Jackson had gathered his few belongings and prepared to leave. He told himself he was simply returning to the life he'd chosen, the solitude that had served him well. Yet as he stood at the edge of the settlement, looking back at the cabins with their smoking chimneys and the people moving purposefully between them, he felt a hollowness he couldn't explain. "So you're leaving without saying goodbye." Jackson turned to find Penny standing behind him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I left a note thanking your father for the hospitality," he said lamely. "How thoughtful," she replied, her voice cool. "And I suppose in another 3 years, when you need supplies, we might see you again." The accusation stung more than it should have. "I don't belong here." "Because you've decided you don't," Penny countered, stepping closer. "Because it's easier to be alone than to risk caring about people who might leave or die or disappoint you." Jackson stiffened. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're running," she said, her voice softening. "I know you're afraid, not of danger. You face that readily enough, but of this." She gestured to the settlement behind her. "Of being part of something larger than yourself." "And what would you know about fear?" Jackson challenged, his own voice rougher than intended. You've had a family, a home, security. And I left it all to come here, Penny interrupted. To this wilderness, this uncertainty. Do you think that wasn't terrifying? Do you think watching my mother die, holding her hand as she slipped away, wasn't the most frightening thing I've ever experienced? Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. We've all lost something, Mr. Mercer. The difference is whether we let that loss define our future. Her words struck him silent, penetrating defenses he'd thought impenetrable. For a long moment, they stood facing each other, the only sound the soft whisper of wind through pine branches. I need to check my cabin, Jackson said finally. After the snow, the roof might need repair. Penny's shoulders fell slightly, but she nodded. Of course. Safe journey. Then, as she turned to leave, Jackson found himself speaking again, the words coming unbidden. I'll return in 3 days. To discuss your father's offer. She paused, looking back at him with a cautious hope that made something tight in his chest loosen slightly. We'll expect you for dinner, then. 6 o'clock. Jackson nodded, shouldering his pack and turning toward the mountain trail. As he walked away, he could feel her watching him, and for the first time in years, the solitude ahead felt less like freedom and more like emptiness. True to his word, Jackson returned to the settlement 3 days later. The intervening time had been filled with restless thoughts and internal debates that left him more uncertain than ever. His cabin, standing silent and cold upon his return, had seemed smaller somehow, its walls closer, its silence no longer peaceful but merely empty. He'd spent one night there before hiking farther up the mountain, sleeping under the stars despite the cold, seeking clarity in the vast wilderness that had been his refuge for so long. But the clarity he sought remained elusive, his thoughts continually returning to a pair of blue eyes and challenging words. When he arrived at the Larson cabin precisely at 6, he found not just Penny and her father waiting, but a gathering of the settlement's families. A celebration, he realized belatedly, in his honor. The evening passed in a blur of introductions, gratitude, good food, and even laughter. Jackson found himself seated beside Penny at dinner, her presence both comforting and unsettling. You came back, she said quietly, during a moment when others were distracted by a child's story. I said I would. He replied, finding it difficult to meet her gaze. Many men say things they don't mean. I'm not many men, Jackson said, then immediately felt foolish for the obvious statement. But Penny smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. No, she agreed. You're not. Later, as the gathering began to disperse, Larson pulled Jackson aside to discuss specifics of the proposition, responsibilities, compensation, living arrangements. Throughout the conversation, Jackson found his attention repeatedly drawn to Penny, who moved easily among the settlers, clearly well-liked and respected despite being relatively new to their community. We'll need your answers soon, Larson said, following Jackson's gaze to where his daughter was helping a child bundle up against the cold night air. Winter's only getting deeper, and we need to know if we're planning with you or without you. Jackson nodded, unable to articulate the turmoil of his thoughts. Tomorrow, he promised. You'll have my answer tomorrow. As the last guests departed, Jackson found himself alone with Penny on the small porch of the Larson cabin. The night was clear and bitterly cold, stars burning like ice crystals against the black sky. Walk with me, Penny asked, wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders. They moved in silence through the sleeping settlement, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Jackson was acutely aware of her beside him, of the careful distance between them, of how easy it would be to breach that distance and how difficult it would be to retreat once crossed. What are you afraid of? Penny asked suddenly, stopping to look up at the stars. Truly, the question, asked without accusation or challenge this time, deserved an honest answer. Jackson found himself speaking truths he'd barely acknowledged to himself. Disappointment, he said finally. There's in me. Mine in them. In myself. He looked toward the mountains, dark shapes against the night sky. Up there, expectations are simple. Survive. Nothing more. And nothing less, Penny added softly. No joy. No connection. No chance to become more than you are alone. There's safety in solitude. Is there? She turned to face him fully. You were alone when you were wounded in the cavalry. Alone when you built your cabin. Alone when the first winter storms came. Was that truly safer, or merely lonelier? Her perception was uncomfortable, like a probe touching a wound he'd pretended had healed. "Why does it matter to you what I choose?" he asked, deflecting. "You hardly know me." Penny was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful in the starlight. "Perhaps I recognize something in you that I understand," she said finally. "The temptation to retreat, to protect yourself from further hurt by refusing to risk attachment." She looked down, then back up at him with startling directness. "After my mother died, I considered joining a convent, not from religious conviction, but from fear that loving anyone else would only lead to more pain." "What changed your mind?" Jackson asked, drawn into her confession despite himself. "I realized I was choosing half a life out of fear of experiencing all of it, pain included." Her smile was tinged with sadness. "The irony is that in trying to avoid grief, I would have guaranteed it. A different kind, perhaps, but grief nonetheless. The grief of possibility unrealized." Her words resonated with uncomfortable truth. Jackson looked away, toward the dark silhouette of his mountain. "I don't know if I can be what they need," he admitted. What the settlement needs. "No one is asking you to be anything other than what you are," Penny said gently. "A man who knows these mountains. A man with skills to share. A man who, when it mattered most, chose to stand with others rather than remain safely apart." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the individual strands of hair escaping her bonnet, could count the freckles across her nose if he'd dared look so directly. "Choose for yourself, Mr. Mercer," she said softly. "Not for my father, not for the settlement. Certainly not for me. But choose the life you truly want, not the one fear has convinced you to accept." With that, she turned and walked back toward her cabin, leaving Jackson alone with stars above and her words echoing in his mind. The next morning, as sunrise painted the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold, Jackson stood at the door of the Larson cabin. He'd spent a sleepless night weighing options, examining fears, and finally confronting the truth he'd been avoiding for longer than he cared to admit. The life he'd chosen had protected him from pain, yes, but it had also prevented healing. Thomas Larson answered his knock, unsurprised to find him there so early. "I've made my decision," Jackson said without preamble. Larson nodded, holding the door wider. "Come in. Penny's just made coffee." Inside, the cabin was warm and filled with the aroma of coffee and baking bread. Penny looked up from the stove, her expression carefully neutral despite the question in her eyes. "Mr. Mercer has come with his answer," Larson said, settling at the small table. Jackson remained standing, suddenly aware of how pivotal this moment felt. "I'll accept your offer," he said, "with one condition." "Name it," Larson replied, reaching for the coffee Penny placed before him. "I keep my cabin," Jackson said. "I'll help the settlement, teach what I know, assist with hunting and the spring timber operations. But I need—" He paused, searching for words. "A retreat," Penny supplied quietly. "A place that's still your own." Jackson nodded, grateful for her understanding. "Yes. Seems reasonable," Larson agreed. "Though I hope as time passes, you'll find less need for distance." "We'll see," Jackson said, allowing himself to glance at Penny, who was watching him with an expression that made his heart beat faster. "I'm willing to try." Spring came to the mountains in a rush of melting snow and new green growth. The settlement, now officially named Larson's Mill, had survived its first winter with minimal hardship, due in no small part to Jackson's guidance on food storage, hunting in deep snow, and weatherproofing their cabins. True to his word, Jackson had divided his time between the settlement and his mountain cabin, gradually spending more days below than above as winter eased into spring. He'd taught hunting techniques to the men, shown the women which early plants were edible, and even begun instructing some of the older children in tracking and wilderness safety. Most significantly, he'd found himself drawn increasingly into the orbit of Penelope Larson. Their friendship had developed through shared work and common purpose. She assisted with his wound care until he was fully healed. He helped her establish a medicinal herb garden as soon as the ground thawed. They spoke of books during quiet evenings, of dreams during walks along the awakening river, of fears during moments of unexpected honesty. On a particularly fine April morning, with birds singing and the scent of pine heavy in the warming air, Jackson found Penny at the edge of the settlement, sketching the mountain view in a leather-bound journal. "You're up early," he observed, offering her a mug of coffee he'd brought from the community kitchen. "The light is best at dawn," she replied, accepting the coffee with a smile. "Besides, I wanted to finish this before the council meeting." Jackson glanced at her sketch, a detailed rendering of the valley with proposed additions marked in careful lines. A school, an expanded mill operation, new housing for the additional settlers expected with the spring wagon trains. "You've been busy," he said, impressed with both the artistry and the forethought. "Father says I'm getting ahead of myself," Penny admitted. "But I believe in planning for the future you want, not just accepting whatever comes." Her words reminded Jackson of their conversation months earlier, when she'd challenged him to choose the life he truly wanted. He'd been making that choice, day by day, ever since, choosing connection over isolation, possibility over safety. "The future you want," he repeated thoughtfully. "And what future is that, Miss Larson?" Penny set aside her journal, turning to face him fully. In the morning light, her eyes were the clear blue of mountain lakes, her honey blonde hair catching the sun where it escaped her simple braid. "One with purpose," she said. "With community. With the freedom to become fully myself." She hesitated, then added more softly, "One where bravery is rewarded with belonging." The charged moment between them was interrupted by a call from the settlement. The first riders of the spring supply train were approaching. Together, they walked back to join the gathering crowd, shoulders occasionally brushing, the contact sending currents of awareness through Jackson that both exhilarated and terrified him. The arrival of the supply train marked a turning point for Larson's mill. Not only did it bring needed goods and mail from the outside world, but it also carried new settlers, 3 families and several single men drawn by rumors of the timber operation's success and the settlement's survival through the harsh mountain winter. Among the new arrivals was a surprise, a young doctor, Martin Collins, answering Thomas Larson's advertisement for a settlement physician. Barely 30, with fashionable spectacles and city manners, Collins was immediately the center of attention, particularly from the settlement's small population of unmarried women. Jackson watched from the periphery as Penny welcomed the newcomer, showing him the small building that had been designated as a future clinic. Something uncomfortable twisted in his chest as he observed their animated conversation. The way Collins leaned closer than necessary, the appreciative glance he gave Penny when she turned to point out some feature of the settlement. That evening, at the celebration welcoming the new arrivals, Jackson found himself uncharacteristically withdrawn, nursing a single cup of cider at the edge of the gathering. His mood didn't go unnoticed. "You're scowling like a thundercloud," Thomas Larson observed, settling beside him on the bench outside the community hall. "Any particular reason?" Jackson shrugged, uncomfortable with the scrutiny and his own reaction. Inside, Penny was demonstrating a Virginia reel to the newcomers, her laugh carrying through the open door as Collins attempted to follow the steps. Larson followed his gaze and chuckled. I see. I don't know what you're implying," Jackson said stiffly. "I'm not implying anything," Larson replied, his tone mild but knowing. "I'm observing a man who's spent months circling something precious without having the courage to reach for it." The blunt assessment hit closer to home than Jackson cared to admit. He'd been careful with Penny, respectful, friendly, increasingly open, but always maintaining a certain distance. Telling himself it was propriety, consideration for her reputation, the natural caution of a man unaccustomed to expressing tender feelings. But watching Collins take her hand for another dance, Jackson was forced to confront another possibility, that his caution stemmed not from respect but from fear. Fear that what he felt might not be reciprocated. Fear that he, a rough-edged mountain man with little to offer beyond practical skills, could never be worthy of someone like Penelope Larson. "She deserves better," he said finally, the words escaping before he could reconsider them. Larson snorted. "Better than a man who saved our entire settlement? Who spent months teaching us to survive in these mountains? Who looks at my daughter like she's the sunrise after the longest night?" He shook his head. "I've known educated men who couldn't start a fire to save their lives, and wealthy men who'd sell their own mothers for another dollar. Neither education nor wealth makes a man worthy, Mercer." Before Jackson could respond, the music inside ended, and Penny appeared at the doorway, slightly flushed from dancing. Her eyes found Jackson immediately, her smile faltering somewhat at his withdrawn posture. I believe my daughter is looking for you, Larson said, standing. Don't make her wait too long. For anything. With a meaningful look, he left Jackson alone with his thoughts and a decision to make. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity to Larson's mill. With the snow fully melted from the mountain passes, lumber operations began in earnest. New cabins rose quickly, the settlement expanding as Thomas Larson's vision began to materialize. Jackson threw himself into work, guiding lumber crews to the best timber stands, helping establish hunting protocols that would sustain the settlement without depleting game populations, teaching wilderness skills to anyone willing to learn. If his increasing busyness coincided with Dr. Collins' growing attention to Penny, he tried not to examine the connection too closely. But avoidance proved impossible when, returning from a 3-day hunting expedition, Jackson encountered Collins leaving the Larson cabin, looking particularly pleased with himself. The doctor tipped his hat with a smile that seemed almost smug. "Mercer, good hunting, I trust? You've been missed in the settlement." Collins' tone was friendly enough, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't referring to the community at large. "Productive," Jackson replied shortly, unsure whether the tension he felt was visible. "Any medical emergencies while I was gone?" "Nothing serious," Collins assured him. "Though I've had the pleasure of spending considerable time with Miss Larson, cataloging the local medicinal plants. She's remarkably knowledgeable for someone without formal training." The casual compliment, delivered with the confidence of a man secure in his standing, intensified Jackson's discomfort. "Penny has always been observant," he said, the familiar use of her name deliberate. Collins raised an eyebrow at the intimacy, but merely nodded. "Indeed. Well, I should return to the clinic. New settlers arriving tomorrow, and I want to be prepared for any issues after their journey." He paused, then added with apparent sincerity, "You know, Mercer, you've done these people a great service. But now that civilization is taking hold, perhaps you'll find yourself free to return to your mountain solitude. I know many here worried about imposing on your preference for independence." The implication was clear. Now that a proper doctor had arrived, Jackson's role as wilderness guide and protector might be less essential. It stung more than it should have. "I go where I'm needed," Jackson replied evenly. "Of course." Collins smiled. "Good day, then." As the doctor walked away, Jackson stood for a long moment, wrestling with emotions he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. Jealousy, inadequacy, fear of loss, the very feelings he'd sought to escape by choosing solitude in the first place. With a deep breath, he continued to the Larson cabin, where he found Penny alone, arranging dried herbs in small cloth bundles. She looked up at his entrance, her expression brightening. "Jackson, you're back earlier than expected. Was the hunting good?" "Good enough," he said, setting down his pack. 2 elk and some smaller game, already dressed and distributed." "Wonderful. Mrs. Wilson was just saying yesterday how they were down to their last bit of salt pork." Penny tied off a bundle of herbs, her movements efficient and practiced. "Dr. Collins has been helping me organize these for the clinic. He's quite knowledgeable, though he admits he has much to learn about local plants." The mention of Collins darkened Jackson's mood further. He seems to be settling in well. Something in his tone made Penny pause and look at him more carefully. Yes, he's been a welcome addition to the settlement. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, unusual in recent months, as their friendship had developed an easy rhythm of conversation and comfortable quiet. "Is something wrong?" Penny finally asked. "You seem distant." Jackson struggled to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. "Nothing's wrong. He stopped, then started again. "The doctor mentioned you've been spending time together." "We have," Penny confirmed, watching him closely. He's eager to learn which local plants can supplement his medical supplies. "Of course," Jackson nodded, feeling foolish for his unwarranted concern. "That makes sense." "Jackson," Penny said carefully, setting aside her herbs to give him her full attention. "Are you concerned about my association with Dr. Collins?" Put so directly, the question forced honesty. He seems to have intentions beyond professional collaboration. A small smile played at the corners of Penny's mouth. "And that bothers you?" "It's not my place, isn't it?" she interrupted, her gaze steady. "After everything we've shared these past months, don't you think you have some claim to an opinion about who I spend time with?" The directness of her question left no room for evasion. I have no right to any claims on your time or attention, Jackson said, the words feeling like rocks in his throat. No right, Penny repeated, a flash of genuine hurt crossing her features. Is that truly how you see our relationship? As conferring no rights, no expectations, no hopes? The vulnerability in her question pierced through Jackson's carefully constructed defenses. Penny, he said, her name soft on his lips. You deserve someone who can offer you more than I can. Someone educated, cultured. Stop, she said firmly, rising to stand before him. I don't recall asking what you think I deserve. I'm asking what you want. The moment stretched between them, fraught with unspoken feelings and fears. Jackson had faced armed men, wild animals, brutal winters, but nothing had terrified him like the simple truth he could no longer deny. I want what I have no right to ask for, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ask anyway, Penny urged, stepping closer. Jackson met her gaze, finding courage in the warmth he saw there. I want a chance to be more than your friend. To see if what I feel for you might be something you could return. The words, once started, came more easily. I know I'm not educated like Collins, not cultured or wealthy. Martin Collins asked my father for permission to court me yesterday. Penny interrupted. Jackson felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath his feet. I see, he said, struggling to keep his voice even. Congratulations. I refused him. Penny continued, her eyes never leaving his face. I told him my heart was already engaged elsewhere, though the gentleman in question seemed frustratingly unaware of it. Hope, dangerous and fragile, bloomed in Jackson's chest. Penny, I've waited months for you to find the courage to speak, she said, a tremor in her voice betraying her own nervousness beneath the confident words. I was beginning to think you never would. I didn't think I had anything to offer someone like you, Jackson admitted. Someone like me? Penny laughed softly. A frontier woman with mud on her boots and herb stains on her hands? I'm not some delicate city flower, Jackson. I'm here, in these mountains, by choice. Building a life by choice. She stepped even closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her. Loving you by choice. The word, loving, hung in the air between them, transforming the moment into something profound. Jackson reached for her hesitantly, his hand cupping her cheek with a gentleness that belied his strength. I'm not good with words, he said roughly. Not good at saying what I feel. But I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you, Penny. It terrifies me how much. Good, she whispered, her hand coming up to cover his. Being afraid means it matters. Jackson leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I think I have since I first saw you by the river. Penny's smile was radiant. I know, she replied. I've been waiting for you to realize it. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration that deepened as hesitation gave way to certainty. When they finally parted, Jackson kept her close, unwilling to relinquish the connection he'd denied himself for so long. I should speak to your father, he said, suddenly aware of propriety. Penny laughed. Father has been waiting for this conversation almost as impatiently as I have. I suspect he'll be rather smug about the whole thing. Summer passed in a golden haze of work and discovery. The settlement flourished, the sawmill operating at full capacity, new buildings rising weekly. Jackson divided his time between guiding lumber operations, teaching hunting and wilderness skills, and courting Penny with a devotion that surprised even himself. Their courtship became something of a settlement legend. The mountain man who brought wildflowers gathered from remote meadows, who carved delicate wooden figures for her collection, who was seen dancing at community gatherings despite his former reticence. And Penny, who hiked with him to mountain lakes few settlers had seen, who learned to track and hunt with quiet competence, who publicly declared she'd rather have a man who could build a cabin with his hands than one who could only discuss architecture from books. As autumn approached, painting the aspen groves in shades of gold, Jackson made a decision. With Thomas Larson's blessing secured weeks earlier, he led Penny on a day-long hike, ostensibly to check beaver dams on the upper reaches of the river. The true destination was a small plateau halfway up his mountain, a level area with spectacular views of the valley below, the settlement now clearly visible as an organized collection of buildings rather than the scattered cabins of the previous year. It's beautiful, Penny said, catching her breath as they reached the clearing. You can see everything from here. That's why I wanted to bring you, Jackson replied, unusually nervous. To show you what I see when I look down at the valley now. He guided her to the edge of the plateau, where the view was clearest. A year ago, I looked down and saw intrusion, complication, reasons to retreat further up the mountain. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Now I look down and see home, purpose, future. Because of you, Penny. Her eyes softened with understanding as he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a ring, a simple gold band with a small pearl. It was my mother's, Jackson explained. The only thing of hers I managed to keep after the raid. I've carried it all these years, never imagining I'd have cause to use it. Penny's eyes filled with tears as he knelt before her. I once thought I was too broken for love, too solitary for marriage, Jackson said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. I was wrong about many things, but most of all about that. You showed me that wounds can heal, that solitude is a choice, not a sentence. He took a deep breath. Penelope Larson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Yes, she answered without hesitation, tears spilling onto her cheeks. Oh, Jackson, yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to take her in his arms, Jackson felt the last pieces of his old self falling away. The man who had believed himself safer alone, who had chosen mountains over people, was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true safety lay not in isolation but in the courage to love despite the risks. I have a surprise for you as well, Penny said when they finally broke apart. She turned him slightly, pointing to a stand of pines at the edge of the plateau. What do you see? Jackson looked where she indicated, seeing nothing unusual at first. Then he noticed a cleared area, partially hidden by the trees. Someone's been cutting timber there. Your future father-in-law has, Penny confirmed with a smile. With some help from the settlement men. I may have mentioned how much I loved this view. Understanding dawned. You want to build here? Not in the settlement. I want to build wherever you'll be happiest, Penny said. Father thought this might be the perfect compromise, close enough to the settlement for daily involvement, but separate enough to maintain your connection to the mountain. She looked uncertain for the first time. If you'd prefer to live in your cabin, or in the settlement proper. Jackson silenced her with a kiss, then rested his forehead against hers. It's perfect, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You're perfect. The wedding took place on the first weekend of October, as the mountains blazed with autumn colors. The entire settlement gathered to celebrate. The ceremony held outdoors beneath an archway of pine boughs and late wildflowers. Penny wore a dress of deep blue, with wildflowers in her honey blonde hair. Jackson, clean-shaven and somewhat uncomfortable in his new suit, waited for her with barely concealed impatience, his transformation from solitary mountain man to beloved community member complete in the eyes of all who attended. When Thomas Larson placed his daughter's hand in Jackson's, the older man's eyes shone with approval and affection. Take care of each other, he said simply. The vows were traditional, but spoken with profound sincerity. As Jackson promised to love, honor, and cherish Penny for all his days, those who had known him longest marveled at the change in him, not just in his willingness to make such public declarations, but in the certainty with which he made them. When it came time for Penny's vows, she departed from tradition, speaking words that caused tears in the eyes of many guests. Jackson Mercer, when first we met, you were a solitary figure watching from the trees. Today, you stand before our community as a man who has taught us to survive, who has defended us at risk to himself, who has shown that even the most guarded heart can open to love. When you said you were too set in your ways for marriage, I told you I had been waiting for you. It was true then, and it remains true now. I have waited for a love that challenged me, respected me, and saw me truly. I have waited for you, and I promise to spend the rest of my life showing you that the waiting was worthwhile. As they were pronounced husband and wife, as Jackson kissed his bride with a tenderness few would have believed him capable of a year earlier, a cheer went up from the assembled community, not just for the union they witnessed, but for the transformation it represented. The cabin on the plateau was completed by the first snowfall, a wedding gift from the settlement. Larger than Jackson's original cabin but built with similar care, it stood as a symbol of the bridge he had built between solitude and connection, between past and future. On the night they moved in, as snow began to dust the pine trees outside their windows. Jackson and Penny stood on their porch, looking down at the lights of the settlement below and up at the stars overhead. "Are you happy?" Penny asked, nestled against him for warmth. Jackson considered the question, comparing the contentment he felt now with the hollow peace he'd once mistaken for happiness. "More than I believed possible," he answered honestly. "More than I thought I deserved." "You deserve every happiness," Penny said, turning in his arms to face him. "And I intend to spend our life together proving it to you." As they stood together between mountain and valley, between stars and earth, Jackson recognized that he had found something he hadn't even known he was seeking. Not just love or companionship, but wholeness. The mountains remained his sanctuary, but they were no longer his escape. With Penny, he had found his true home, not in a place, but in a person who had waited for him to find his way back to himself.